have an unidentified flying object.
I'm Jack Oswald, and you're listening.
This is Moulton Howe, and you're listening to...
I'm Richard C. Hoagland, and you're listening to...
I'm Art Bell, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
We have an unidentified flying object.
The one, the only, true journalist, Linda Moulton Howe. Miss Howe, welcome back.
Oh, thank you, Dr. J, very much. And this whole context of what you and I and others are trying to get to the bottom of, what does our government, the Austrian government, England, and around the world, what do governments know about an alien presence, and how much of the alien presence is underground, and how much construction has been done in the United States and other nations that relate to putting military and government authorities underground? And would that, if we knew the truth, would that be the reason that they spent all this money to make a tunnel deep through a mountain for 30-some miles?
And that's what also boggles me. That's what they're talking about publicly. But how many of these underground tunnels are we not aware about? Over the decades, and I know you know this, there have been several people that have talked about there is literally under our feet in the United States and globally a set of tunnel systems with high-speed maglev trains that could transport people and materials from base to base and other places. And they're built with these nuclear boring machines. I mean, they're humongous in size. I can't even speculate on the cost. I'm sure I could, Google it. The point is what they do is as they bore through the tunnel, they actually create, I think, heating it up so much that they create glass, a glass-like substance of the sand or the dirt that's around it, and that's what they have been using. But yes, the underground part really strikes me because you hear stories going back from 47 from Admiral Byrd. Actually, I've read a story here from Preston Dennett, I'm sure you know him, a UFO investigator, MUFON investigator actually, for 30 years. He's on his 19th book, getting ready to release his 20th book. Wrote a book specifically about California. And he talked about in the 30s, they were excavating Los Angeles for gold. And they found caverns that didn't seem natural. And when they got there, lizard people were there, and it scared them so bad that they sealed those tunnels, and you never heard about it again. So these stories, as you know, go back decades and even possibly centuries. I mean, look what happened in Dulce. I remember, if it wasn't for you, I would have never read UFO Highway. And that book startled me.
Yeah, it is a revelation. And all of this ties back to a documentary that CNN broadcast, and I believe it was 1988, and I remember because there were a group of us that included Bill Hamilton and myself, and I think perhaps Jim Mars. There were 6 or 7 of us. We'd been at a conference, and we had heard that CNN was going to broadcast a documentary about continuity of government under the National Programming Office. At the time, in 1988, no one anywhere was supposed to know anything about this. And what we all watched with our own eyes, minds, and ears, and that's 88 to 98, 98 to 2008, that's almost 30 years ago now. They had backlighted, voice-altered 2 or 3 men who were talking to the CNN reporter about working on underground tunnels and excavated complexes, 9 of them at the time in 88 in the United States, costing billions of dollars each. And these backlighted people were whistleblowers of the first order because at the time in 1988, no American taxpayer was supposed to know anything about continuity of government under the National Programming Office. And you can Google that today and you will find some history. But here was the bottom line. The documentary was the first introduction to an American public that there was waiting in the wings a legal structure that if there was a nuclear attack or some sort of asteroid, something that would fall into the category of cataclysmic attack in the United States of America or coming to the United States, that a list of people in intelligence and in the government would be whisked away underground, and there they would stay for the continuity of government. And what surprised everybody then was that instead of the elected officials from the surface of the earth, the people going underground would be a list of people in the CIA, NSA, DIA, ONR, and so forth. And that was the big reveal on that 1988 CNN program. Now, here's another interesting piece. I was so stunned, and all the rest of us watching were so stunned by the revelations. The very next morning, I knew people at CNN. I had worked there in the 80s, and I called up, talked with an assignment editor, said I would very much like to talk with the producer of that program that you broadcast last night. And they said, we'll try, but he doesn't work here full time. He only did this project on a part-time contract basis. And I said, well, would you please explain to me? This was so important, so groundbreaking, but what we don't understand in Los Angeles, the group of us who saw this, we only heard that it was going to be broadcast on the day of air. There had been no advance promotion, nothing. And the assignment person went so far to tell me, yes, we've had a lot of inquiries, and it is my understanding that there was a great debate about whether this should be broadcast. This is all true, what I'm telling you. This happened. This is my firsthand knowledge. Now, how the whistleblowers came to do that program on CNN and open up this vast realization to the people who watched CNN that night that the United States government had another government waiting in the wings in the off chance that there would be something that would be huge, an EMP pulse, a nuclear attack, and this other government would go underground. Now, in tandem with that, this is another important piece to underscore how vast the installations must be in caverns and in the boring machine created spaces under the we'll call it the surface of our planet, perhaps in all nations of the world, but certainly in the United States. It was approximately that same year of around 1987, 1988. It was another conference, not that one. A man approached me and he said, I have followed your work and I'd like you to know about something that happened to me personally. And he gave me his background. He was a PhD in physics, had a very advanced physics level of what he was working on as he explained it to me. And at the time, he was working as, I think I recall, it was at Stanford or Berkeley. And he said that in around the first year of the Reagan administration, in the early 80s, that he got a call from the man who was head of the Reagan, what we called it, the Star Wars program, and that the idea was that there would be a meeting, and the physicist would go to wherever this place was to meet the head of the Star Wars, we'll call it the physics program. And so in front of him is this man bigger than life who says, I'd like to offer you a job, and money will be no object, and you can work on anything you want. You can have as much equipment, as much staff as you want. And the only thing I would ask is that you would have to sign a contract to go underground for 3 years. And the physicist said, I looked at him and I said, 3 years underground? You mean I'd leave my family, my wife, for 3 years? Where would I be? And the head of the Star Wars program said that he couldn't say, but that it would be worth it because he knew that this physicist loved to play tennis. And he said, I can guarantee you that we have tennis courts under blue sky with white puffy clouds and sunshine like the most beautiful day that you have ever experienced on the top of the earth. And the physicist was so taken aback because he said, whatever they're doing for long-term assignments with people that would be signing non-disclosure agreements, the facilities to create day, blue sky, clouds, and tennis courts meant that there must be enormous facilities. And that, I've never forgotten that.
Here's a question from Luca, Bismarck, North Dakota. Were ETs involved in underground projects? I don't know what...
okay, well, now let's go to programs that I have done recently on Coast and at Earth Files have to do with some of the whistleblowers that are beginning to emerge now. One of them is working with whistleblowers. That's Tom DeLong, which we can talk about, and his new book, Secret Machines. Another very important one is William Mills Tompkins. He's a retired aerospace engineer, and he's the author of a book that came out in December called Selected by Extraterrestrials, My Life in the Top Secret World of UFOs, Think Tanks, and Nordic Secretaries. And if we start with William Mills Tompkins, he celebrated his 93rd birthday on May 30th. He's a very sharp 93-year-old. And when I did the interview with him, it was a 3-hour recorded interview, and I don't do many of those in my career where you are doing nonstop for 3 hours doing Q&A with somebody, and we did. He and I talked for 3 hours. And in the process of those 3 hours, he goes back to World War II. He was born 93 years ago, and by the time that he was in his teens and in high school, he had a natural gift in which he could look at just about anything and create models that would be precise down to the tiniest detail. And his father, they lived in Long Beach in California, and his father would take his gifted teenage son down to the harbor to look at all of the Navy ships, the different ones that were there. And this was approximately 41, those years. 42 is when the Navy asked him to go to boot camp and join them, because in those preceding 3 or 4 years, this teenagers' models of American naval ships in Long Beach had been picked up by a store in Hollywood to show as a demonstration, sort of patriotically, here is the force of the American Navy. And some naval intel guy had seen all of this in this department store and was stunned at the accuracy, contacted the teenage boy's father, arranged a meeting at their house, said that they were going to have to take all of these ships out of this, we'll call it department store window, because they affected national security, that the teenager was putting top secret details on these models. And the son and the father said, well, we had no idea. This is a talent that he has. And the intel guy said, we understand you can't do it anymore. We have to take these models from the store in the interest of national security, but we would be very interested in having you come to work for the United States Navy. And that's how this gifted teenager ended up going into the Navy. and starting in 1942. And what is he introduced to for his work? He is shown photographs of UFOs, silver discs, in the Earth's atmosphere, and then what he says were described as something like battleship fleets out in the solar system or wherever they were, and he's asked to make scale models of whatever is on these photos. That led to him learning that World War II, this is his statement, World War II was an extraterrestrial war fought through human bodies. That is...
Actually, I'm going to say I'm glad you brought up the year 1942 because everybody thinks it was only after Roswell. Yet we have proof right here, right now. And as a matter of fact, there was already a question that was written a while ago that when you were talking about this, it's Amy from Honokai, Hawaii. Do you know about the crash in the Black Forest?
I'm assuming, I know, I've heard of that, Germany. I think it was 1936 when Hitler allegedly met aliens.
Well, I've heard of a Black Forest crash, but don't know nearly as much about that as I do about what happened on April 12th, 1941 in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. I've done a lot of reporting about that and interviewed Paul Blake Smith, who had the book come out in March of 2016. It's called Mo 41, the bombshell before Roswell. It is a superb book. Everybody should read this book. And he lives in Cape Girardeau, grew up in Missouri. He became very interested in all the rumors about a UFO crash with bodies in April of 1941. And before this book, going back into the early 90s, there had been some work done by Bob Wood, PhD. He had worked for McDonnell Douglas, and his son Ryan Wood, where Bob had gotten a huge download of documents from a guy named Timothy Cooper, whose father had worked in a printing press down in White Sands. And Bob Wood had retired from McDonnell Douglas, had gotten all these documents, had started doing analysis, and in one of the documents called the Majestic 12 White Hot, I think it was called White Hot Analysis, or preliminary report, it said that, and the words are right there in the document, that a neutronic propulsion device was gathered from the 1941 Missouri crash and hand-delivered to Robert Oppenheimer for the development of the atomic bomb. That 1941 Missouri reference in the Majestic 12 documents in the 90s that Bob Wood got was the first that any of us had any hint that there was something 6 years before Roswell. Well, jump to this year, in March, comes this book, and with fascinating facets and subtitles and all sorts of things that are relating to April 1941, and one of the most interesting gets into the political climate of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Harry Truman was a Democratic senator who had a lot of power in terms of DOD budget. George Marshall was the war chief, and all of them were 33rd degree Masons. 33rd degree Masons keep secrets. In fact, their entire life of their rituals are designed to not be shared with their family or with the public. So what Paul Blake Smith revealed in this book is that there is a crash, there are three bodies, and they look exactly alike, like clones. And one is alive when various rescuers get to the site, and that a photographer is there with one of those flash cameras that you would see in 1941, big flash camera, and that a photograph is taken when a Reverend Huffman, who is called by the police, who come and pick up the Reverend at his home that night, telling him that there's been a crash, that there are victims, and they want to pick up Reverend Huffman to give last rites to the bodies. He doesn't know that he's going to a crash of what appears to be somewhat triangular-shaped craft, and that there are these bodies, and that it's the Reverend who told his family later that night they looked like they had been cut from a cookie cutter. Today, we would say that those bodies were clones. They were cloned beings. They looked exactly alike, and that we're dealing with an alien presence that uses clones and hybridization for repopulation, for making all kinds of worker bees, and that those three in that particular craft were clones, and that the one that was alive, the Reverend Huffman, bent over, saw, told the family it was distinctly not human. The craft, none of it was from Earth. And about 2 weeks after that, a photographer from one of the local media came to Reverend Huffman's house and hand-delivered one of the photographs of the being held up by two men, one on either side, holding on to this non-human-looking being under each armpit. And the Reverend Huffman showed this photograph to his son, to his family, where they lived in Cape Girardeau at the time. Again, this is 1941. What would become, much later, a grandchild to Reverend Huffman, Charlotte Mann is her name.
Yes.
About 10 years later, she would be a little kid, and she would still be exposed with her own eyes and mind to this photograph. She is the person who talked to the Woods. I've done a long interview with her that is at Earth Files, goes back to 2004, so 10 years ago. I did an in-depth interview with her with a sketch of what she remembered of the photo, what her grandfather had told the family, all of that. And that is, I'm laying out, this is the background for why there was a lot of substance to this crash before Paul Blake Smith got into it. Now, here's what he adds that is so fascinating. In the current archives today of people who worked in the FDR and Truman administrations, Cordell Hull was the Secretary of State for FDR, and 41 was when FDR was still president. And there is a now archived document that has been in many people's hands, including the Roswell Museum here in New Mexico. And it was signed and notarized statement by 3 girls who were sisters and were related to the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, through their father was a relative to Cordell Hull. And the father said that one day during the FDR administration, this reverend, completely different from Huffman, went to Washington to visit his cousin, and that Cordell Hull took this reverend down into the bowels, the basement, underground, we're back underground again, of the nation's capital. And that he took the reverend into a room where there were 3 large glass jars, each with some kind of liquid that he suspected was formaldehyde or something like that, and that there was an alien, non-human being with a large head and large eyes in each of those 3 jars, and that Cordell Hull, Secretary of State under FDR, told his cousin, the Reverend, that these were creatures from outer space, and they had been retrieved from Cape Girardeau. Now, we don't have the Reverend on the record. The archive is going through the daughters, but I think, and so does Paul Blake Smith, that this is a strong piece of historical information that we should all take seriously for this question. In 1941, there was no CIA,
That's
NSA,
right.
CIA. There was no Area 51. There was no Wright-Patterson as we know it today. Where would be the safest place if you're a 33rd degree Mason government? Everybody who is holding office back then is 33rd degree Mason because it was sort of the thing to do, and they all kept secrets. The one thing that the Masons loved, because it was built on Masonic principles, was the nation's capital.
Capital, yes.
Built at the beginning of finished at the end of the 19th century, not too far from the beginning of the 20th century. And here is such an interesting piece. I started doing some research on the Department of the Interior, just what is known about the archaeological drawings, or we'll call it architectural, both archaeological and architectural drawings, of the creation of the nation's capital. And you find that in as early as 1911, that there was correspondence about the Department of the Interior wanting to get material that had been stored in underground basement rooms under the Capitol moved so that they could put more material down under the Capitol. Today, there are at least, they think officially, at least 3 underground levels below the Capitol. Paul Blake Smith has references to 7. That would be 4 that have not been discussed publicly. We're not sure. Is it 3, 4, 5, 6, 7? But the whole point is, underneath the Capitol are underground rooms, according to the official Department of Interior. And that material has been stored, moved out, stored, moved out. And so I'll call it the educated speculation is that FDR would have ordered that this astounding discovery of the craft and these 3 bodies would have been transported by the Sykeston military branch that was there. That's only about 23, 24 miles south of Cape Girardeau. There was a military unit there. And they would have gotten the material, probably on trucks, taken it to Washington, D.C., who knows how they would have gotten it underground. But the assumption is that this would tie into the Cordell Hull showing to his cousin of the 3 jars with 3 bodies not of this world. Now, how long would this stuff have stayed there? If it was 1941, would it have been moved to Wright-Patterson by 1947 or 48? Possibly, likely, that it still wouldn't be there. But this shows, all of this, that the underground, even in Washington, D.C., in 1941 and earlier, underneath the nation's capital, would have been considered one of the most secure places to hide anything that was highly secret in the United States. And from there, coming up through history, it was from April 41 to December 7th, 1941, when Pearl Harbor was attacked. That is only like 3/4 of a year. We get attacked. We're into World War II, and those same people that would have had knowledge about the crash at Cape Girardeau, the retrieval of those bodies, the retrieval of a disc that had a neutronic propulsion device that would be applied to the development of the bomb as we got into the war, that would be dropped first as a test at White Sands at the Trinity site at the middle of July 1945, and 2 weeks later dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan, officially ending World War II because of the staggering power of those atomic bombs. Underneath all of that Think about it. 42, 43, 44, 45. In those 4 years, if everything that Paul Blake Smith has dug up in this new book